Chapter 1. The Scent of Pine and Blood. The air in the cabin was thick. It smelled of pine from the crackling fire, of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, and of blood, the coppery tang that always clung to her home. Lyra worked silently, her fingers steady as she stitched the gash on the rogue's flank. The wolf, a scrawny male with fur the color of dirt, lay unnaturally still on her hearth. His breathing was shallow, a quiet rhythm in the deep silence of the woods. This was her life. A quiet, hidden existence patching up the broken things the world threw away. She wanted nothing more than to be left alone, a ghost in a forest that kept its secrets. Her heart felt like a cold, smooth stone in her chest because that's what survival required. To feel was to be weak, and weakness got you killed. She learned that lesson a long time ago. Finishing the last stitch, she snipped the thread with her teeth. The rogue didn't flinch. He was one of 3 she was hiding tonight. Another was asleep in the cellar, and a third, a young female, was curled in the corner, watching Lyra with wary yellow eyes. They were outcasts, driven from their packs for being too weak, too old, or too defiant. Lyra understood them. She was an outcast too. She wasn't a rogue wolf, but she was just as alone, just as hunted in her own way. Helping them was a risk, a stupid one. But leaving them to die felt like leaving a part of herself to bleed out in the snow. She poured a salve that smelled of chamomile and yarrow into her palm, the warmth a small comfort against her cold skin. She gently worked the ointment into the angry, stitched skin around the wound. The young female in the corner whined softly, a high, thin sound of fear. Lyra's head snapped up. She listened. The fire popped. The wind whispered through the eaves. Nothing. Still, the hair on her arms stood on end. The forest she knew, every tree and every shadow, felt different tonight. It felt like it was holding its breath. She saw her own reflection in the cabin's single window. A pale, serious face with eyes that had seen too much. Eyes that looked just like her mother's. She pushed the thought away, a familiar, sharp pain. Thinking of her mother was a luxury she couldn't afford. It was a door she had locked and barricaded years ago, because the memories always brought the monsters with them. Her life depended on being unnoticed, on being a ripple in a pond so small that no one ever looked her way. Then she heard it. It started low, a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and up her spine. It wasn't the growl of a bear or the cry of a mountain lion. It was a howl. But not just any howl. It wasn't the desperate, lonely call of a rogue. It wasn't the unified song of a pack. No. This was one voice, singular and absolute. It was a sound of pure, undiluted power. A sound of command, a sound of possession, an alpha's howl. It ripped through the night, tearing the silence to shreds. The sound was a declaration, a king announcing his presence in a kingdom he already owned. The wolves in her cabin flattened themselves to the floor, whimpering, their fear a thick, sour scent in the air. Lyra stood frozen, the small pot of salve slipping from her numb fingers to clatter on the floor. Her heart, that cold, useless stone, began to hammer against her ribs. That howl. It wasn't just in the forest. It felt closer. It felt like it was for her. The sound wrapped around her little cabin, a promise and a threat all in one. It scraped along her nerves, an ancient, terrifying call that her very soul recognized and recoiled from. Alphas were chaos. They were destruction. An alpha was the reason her mother was gone, the reason she lived in hiding. And now, one was here. In her woods. The quiet world she had so carefully built was about to be torn apart because a beast was roaring at her door, and she knew with a certainty that iced her blood that it would not be ignored. Chapter 2. A Beast in the Snow. Following the sound was madness. Lyra knew it. Every instinct, honed by years of living on the edge of danger, screamed at her to douse the fire, board the window, and hide in the cellar with the other scared animals. But she couldn't. That howl wasn't just a random display of power. It felt like a summons. It was too close. Ignoring it was like ignoring a wildfire raging toward your home. You had to see where it was, how fast it was moving. Because knowing the shape of the monster was the only way to survive it. Pulling on her thickest cloak, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It wasn't much of a weapon against an alpha, but holding it made her feel a little less like prey. The forest was a world of white and black. Fresh snow blanketed everything, glowing faintly under a sliver of moon, while the ancient pines stood like silent, dark sentinels. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. It was quiet now. Too quiet. The normal night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, were gone. The entire forest was cowering, just like the wolves in her cabin. As she moved deeper into the trees, her boots sinking into the powder, a sense of being watched crawled over her skin. Was it him? The alpha? Or was it just her fear painting eyes in the shadows? She pushed forward, the iron poker held tight in her fist, her breath misting in the frigid air. Then she saw the tracks. They were huge, bigger than any wolf she had ever seen, pressed deep into the snow. The stride was long, powerful. Alongside the paw prints there was a drag mark, as if something heavy had been pulled through the snow. And then she saw the blood, dark splashes of it, almost black against the pure white. A lot of it. The trail was messy, chaotic. A fight then. He wasn't just hunting. He had been hunted. The thought sent a strange, conflicted tremor through her. An alpha? Wounded? It seemed impossible. They were gods of this world, untouchable and cruel. An alpha in pain was a concept she couldn't quite grasp. She followed the trail of blood and disturbed snow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It led her to a small clearing dominated by a massive, snow-dusted boulder. And there, slumped against it, was the source of the howl. But it wasn't a wolf. It was a man. He was enormous, a giant of a man built with the raw power of the beast he held inside. His dark hair was matted with snow and blood. His clothes, fine and black, were torn to ribbons. A deep, vicious gash ran across his chest, weeping blood that steamed in the cold. Around the wound, she saw it. A faint, ugly dusting of silver powder. Wolfsbane. Poison. A coward's weapon. Her first instinct was to turn and run. Flee. This was an alpha, the embodiment of everything she feared, everything she hated. He was the monster from her nightmares made real. Leaving him here to die was justice. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as she stood there watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, she saw not a monster, but just a man bleeding out in the snow, alone. He was dying, and she was a healer. It was a curse, that part of her, the part that couldn't turn away from suffering no matter the source. Her trauma screamed at her to save herself, but the core of her being, the part her mother had nurtured, whispered for her to save him. The conflict tore her apart. Could she really help the same kind of beast that had destroyed her life? With a choked sob of frustration, she knelt beside him. His skin was like ice. His breathing was dangerously faint. He was going to die. Right here. And she couldn't let it happen. It was a weakness she hated, this compassion. It was a liability. But it was also who she was. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his and pulled. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Every step back toward her cabin was a struggle, her body screaming in protest. She was dragging death into her sanctuary. She was inviting the storm inside. And as she finally got him through her door, collapsing with him onto the floor, his eyes fluttered open. Just for a second. They weren't brown or blue. They were gold. Molten, predatory gold. His lips parted, and a single impossible word escaped on a ragged breath. Lyra. Chapter 3. A name on his lips. Her blood turned to ice. Lyra. He had said her name. The sound of it, rough and broken from his lips, echoed in the sudden silence of the cabin. It was impossible. No one knew her name. She had buried it years ago, along with the girl who once answered to it. How? How could this stranger, this monster bleeding on her floor, know the one secret she guarded with her life? Her mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Had he heard it somewhere? Was it a lucky guess? A fever-induced delusion? Fear, sharp and acidic, clawed up her throat. He wasn't just some random alpha who had stumbled into her woods. He was something else. Something connected to her. The thought was more terrifying than the howl had been. He lost consciousness again, his head slumping to the side. His breathing was a harsh, wet rattle. The wound on his chest was worse than she'd thought. The silver was actively poisoning him, eating away at his flesh, fighting his shifter healing. She had to work fast. Forgetting the impossible question of her name, she fell back into the familiar rhythm of her work. She ripped away the tattered remains of his shirt. The sheer size and power of his body up close was intimidating. His chest was a landscape of hard muscle, scarred and brutal, now ruined by the poisoned gash. As she began to clean the wound, her fingers brushing against his skin, it happened. A jolt. It wasn't static from the dry winter air. It was a deep, resonant shock that traveled up her arm and straight into her core. It felt like a string inside her had been plucked, a note she hadn't heard in a lifetime. Her own heart stuttered. Thump, thump, thump. It was wrong. Out of sync. Then she felt it again, a phantom pulse beneath her fingertips, a rhythm that wasn't hers. It was his. Thump, thump, thump. Her heart skipped again, trying to match it. It was a terrifying, intimate feeling, a magnetic pull. It felt like her body was being tuned to his, a song only they could hear. The faded mate bond, the old stories, the whispers her mother had dismissed as fairy tales meant to trap young women, crashed into her mind. She scrambled back, away from him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. No, it couldn't be. Not him. Not an alpha. Not this man who represented the ruin of her world. This bond was the ultimate cage. To be tied to another, to have your very heartbeat enslaved, it was her worst nightmare. This was why she lived alone. This was why she trusted no one. Because connection was a leash and love was the hand that held it. She looked at him, at this man who was both her patient and her enemy, and felt a wave of dizzying, conflicting emotions. Hatred for what he was, fear of what he represented, and a strange, horrifying pull of something else. Something that felt dangerously like belonging. Was this what her mother had feared for her? Not just the cruelty of alphas, but the treachery of fate itself? Outside, the wind began to howl again, but its voice had changed. It was no longer a simple winter storm. It swirled around the small cabin with a hungry, intelligent sound. It clawed at the roof and whispered against the window pane. A shadow, vast and fleeting, passed over the moon, plunging the forest into an even deeper darkness. The power radiating from the dying alpha on her floor, combined with the sudden shocking spark of a mate bond, had sent out a beacon. It was a signal to the things that hunted in the dark, the forces drawn to such potent magic. She had not just invited a storm into her home. She had lit a fire on a dark mountain, and now, everything was coming to see the light. A floorboard on her porch groaned under a heavy weight that was not the snow. A twig snapped, sharp and deliberate, just outside her door. Someone was out there. The unseen forces had found her. Her tiny, hidden world had just become the center of a very dangerous map. Chapter 4: The Unwanted Brand. The cabin grew stiflingly warm as the night bled on. Lyra sat in her one rickety chair, the iron poker lying across her lap, watching the alpha sleep. He was a paradox of stillness and violence. Even in unconsciousness, his body held a dangerous energy. The muscles in his arms and chest coiled like sleeping serpents. She had cleaned and stitched his wound as best she could, her hands working with a detached professionalism that felt like a lie. because every time her skin brushed against his, that strange, electric hum echoed through her bones. It was a terrifying song, a melody her soul seemed to know but her mind refused to accept. The forest outside had fallen silent again, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the hush of an audience waiting for the next act of a brutal play. Having done all she could for him medically, she knew the rest was up to his own formidable strength. The silver poisoning needed to be fought from within, and his shifter physiology was his only real defense. But the fever was climbing. A sheen of sweat slicked his skin, and a low, guttural sound rumbled in his chest with every breath. It was the sound of a beast dreaming. She should feel nothing for him. He was an alpha, the symbol of her every fear, the living embodiment of a past she could never outrun. He was a storm that had crashed into her quiet world. Yet watching the fever rack his powerful frame stirred something unwelcome inside her, that cursed healer's pity. It was a weakness, and it was going to get her killed. Suddenly, he arched his back with a strangled cry. His body convulsed. It wasn't a human movement. It was something more primal, more fluid. His fingers curled, nails thickening into dark, sharp claws that dug into her wooden floor. A tremor ran through him, a wave of raw, untamed power breaking its leash. Lyra shot to her feet, clutching the poker, her heart seizing in her chest. His eyes snapped open, but they were not the eyes of the man. Gone was any hint of confusion or pain. They were replaced by two burning, solid gold orbs glowing with an animalistic light. There was no recognition in them, only instinct, only hunger. The wolf was in control. Before she could even scream, he moved. He was not a man anymore. He was a blur of contained fury. He lunged from the floor, not at her throat, but at her. He slammed her against the rough-hewn cabin wall, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. The poker clattered uselessly to the floor. His strength was absolute, pinning her effortlessly. One of his large hands clamped around her throat, not squeezing, but holding her in place. The other hand ripped the collar of her tunic, exposing the pale skin of her shoulder and neck. She struggled, her fists beating against his chest, but it was like striking a stone wall. He lowered his head, his hot breath ghosting over her skin, and the growl that vibrated through his chest shook her to the very soul. It was a sound of possession. Mine. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded in her shoulder. His teeth, longer, sharper than a human's, sank into her flesh. A scream tore from her throat, raw and terrified. It wasn't just the physical agony. It was the violation. It was the branding. She felt a searing heat spread from the wound, a wave of dizzying magic that felt like fire and ice all at once. It was a claim, an unbreakable seal of ownership being burned directly into her being, binding her to the very thing she feared most. Through the haze of pain, she saw a faint silver light flash between them, a mystical chain being forged in blood and violence. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. His body went limp against hers, the golden light in his eyes fading. He collapsed, pulling her down with him to the floor, unconscious once more. The man was back, but the damage was done. Trembling, Lyra pushed his dead weight off her and scrambled away, clutching her bleeding shoulder. The wound throbbed with a pain that was more than just physical. It was a scar on her soul. She was marked. Chapter 5. Ashes and Cages. When he woke for the second time, it was to the scent of his own blood, her blood, and her terror. Cassian's eyes, human and startlingly clear this time, flew open. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his gaze locking onto her. She was huddled in the far corner of the cabin, her hand pressed to her savaged shoulder, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and fear. His gaze dropped from her face to the fresh, bloody bite mark marring her skin. A look of profound, soul-deep horror washed over his features. He knew. He knew what his beast had done while he was lost in the fever's grip. He didn't say he was sorry. The words would have been a useless, hollow insult. Instead, his expression hardened, becoming a mask of cold, grim authority. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice a low, gravelly command. The warmth of a patient was gone, replaced by the chilling steel of an alpha. Lyra laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You think I want to? You barge into my life, your monster attacks me, and now you're giving me orders? Get out!" She spat the words, her voice shaking with rage. This was her home, her sanctuary. He had no right. He rose to his feet, a staggering, painful movement that showcased his immense power and the effort it took to control it. "You don't understand," he growled, taking a step toward her. "That mark," he gestured toward her shoulder, "it's a beacon. Before, you were hidden. A ghost. Now every enemy I have can smell you. They can feel our connection. They will come for you, not just to hurt you, but to use you to destroy me. Because that's what they do to the mates of alphas they can't kill." He didn't need to elaborate. The chilling story was there in his tone, in the bleak darkness of his eyes. "So you'll leave," she shot back, defiant even as a tremor of fear ran through her. "You'll leave and they will follow you." "They are already here," he said, his gaze flicking toward the single window. "They have been watching since my howl brought them. The only reason they haven't stormed this cabin is because they fear me more than they want you. But that won't last. You are no longer safe here. I am taking you with me." His words were a death sentence to the life she knew. "No, I am not your prisoner." She would die here on her own terms before she let another alpha dictate her life. This was the exact trap her mother had warned her about, the gilded cage of protection that was just another form of control. He saw the wild, cornered look in her eyes and his jaw tightened. He knew she wouldn't come willingly. Just as the standoff reached a fever pitch, the cabin door creaked open. Two men, built like mountains and dressed in black, stepped silently inside. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their eyes missing nothing. They looked at Cassian, their alpha, and waited for the order. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. As they moved toward her, Lyra grabbed the poker again, swinging it wildly. But it was a child's defense against titans. One of the men caught it easily, wrenching it from her grasp. The other scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She fought, kicking and screaming, but it was useless. Cassian turned his back on her, unable to watch. He walked to her hearth, picked up a burning log, and tossed it onto the dry thatch of her cot. Flames erupted, hungry and fast. Lyra stopped struggling, her body going rigid with shock as she watched her home, her entire world, begin to burn. He was erasing her. He was wiping her off the map. They dragged her out into the cold night and forced her into a sleek black vehicle. As it pulled away, she stared through the rear window, her face a mask of numb horror, watching the orange flames devour her tiny cabin, consuming her past until there was nothing left but smoke and ashes rising into the unforgiving sky. Chapter 6. The Silver Cage. The journey was a long, silent torture. Lyra sat pressed against the cold leather of the car door, as far away from him as she could get. Cassian sat opposite her, a formidable silhouette in the darkness, his face unreadable. He never looked at her, instead staring out the window at the endless blur of snow-laden trees. The silence was heavier than any argument could have been, filled with the unspoken violence of what he had done. He hadn't just saved her. He had stolen her, burned her life to the ground, and branded her as his own. He believed he was protecting her, but Lyra knew the truth because she had lived it once before. Protection was just a prettier word for a cage built not of iron bars but of an alpha's will. They finally arrived at a place that couldn't be called a home. It was a fortress, a monolithic structure of dark gray stone and smoked glass. It rose from the frozen landscape like a monument to power and paranoia. There were no welcoming lights, no soft edges. It was a modern, brutalist masterpiece of isolation. High walls topped with what looked like silver wire surrounded the compound. Men dressed in the same black as his guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and disciplined. This wasn't a pack house. It was a prison. This was a place designed to keep the world out. But more than that, Lyra suspected it was designed to keep something in. Cassian led her inside. The interior was just as cold and imposing as the exterior. The floors were polished black marble that echoed their footsteps. The walls were vast expanses of bare concrete, and the furniture was sparse, modern, and uncomfortable looking. There was no art, no warmth, no sign of life. It was the home of a man who was afraid of everything, especially himself. He walked her through echoing halls to a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. "This will be your room." It was beautiful, horribly, luxuriously beautiful. A massive bed with silk sheets, a fireplace already lit, and a wall of glass that looked out onto a snow-covered courtyard. But it was a beautiful cage. Lyra's eyes immediately went to the window. It was a single, seamless pane of glass. There was no handle, no latch. She turned to the door. It was solid oak, with a heavy, complex lock on the outside. Her heart sank. He had thought of everything. "There are rules," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You will not leave this room without an escort. You will not go into the West Wing. Ever. You will not try to contact the outside world. This is for your safety." His justification was a monotonous drumbeat that she was already beginning to hate. It was the excuse of every tyrant who believed his control was a gift. Her new, immediate goal crystallized in that moment with blinding clarity. Escape. Survive. She wouldn't let him break her. She had survived the wilderness alone. She would survive this gilded prison. He seemed to read the defiance in her eyes. A flicker of something, regret, sadness, crossed his face before it was gone, replaced by the mask of the unfeeling alpha. "I will have food sent up," he said, before turning to leave. He pulled the heavy door shut behind him. And then she heard it. The loud, definitive click of the lock sliding into place. The sound echoed in the cavernous room, sealing her fate. She was officially a prisoner. She was trapped. Alone in the oppressive silence, she walked to the massive window. The moon was high now, its cold white light pouring into the room. She caught her reflection in the glass, and for a moment didn't recognize the pale, haunted woman staring back. Her gaze fell to her shoulder. In the moonlight, the bite mark was glowing. It wasn't an angry red anymore. It was a soft, ethereal silver, pulsing with a faint, magical light. It was a brand. It was a target. It was the key to her cage. Chapter 7. The Echoing Fortress. The morning light that streamed through the seamless glass wall was pale and cold. It did nothing to warm the opulent prison where Lyra now lived. She had spent the first few days in a state of defiant fury, testing the window for any weakness, studying the door for any flaw. But the cage was perfect. It was a testament to Cassian's wealth and paranoia. Her anger, having nothing to break against, had cooled into a hard, watchful resolve. She was a survivor. She had survived the wilderness. She had survived loss. And she would survive this. This place, this echoing fortress of stone and silence, was just another forest with a different kind of predator. She refused to be his prey. She simply had to learn the new rules of this hunt. Eventually, a silent guard with a face like carved granite came to her door. He didn't speak, only gestured for her to follow. The journey to a dining hall felt like a procession for the condemned. Every footstep echoed on the black marble, a lonely sound in the vast, empty spaces. The air was sterile, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and nothing else. There were no personal touches, no warmth, no life. It was less a home and more a museum dedicated to the concept of emptiness. Men like the one escorting her stood at every intersection, their gazes blank but missing nothing. They were specters in this stone tomb, and she was the only living thing among them. It was deeply unsettling because this level of security felt like it was designed for more than just keeping a lone, unwilling woman inside. What was he so afraid of? As they walked, a strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck. It was a feeling she'd had in the deep woods before a storm, a pressure in the air that spoke of immense, volatile power. It wasn't just Cassian's alpha presence. This was something different. It was heavier, hungrier. It felt as if the very stones of the mansion were saturated with a monstrous energy, a beast that was far larger than the man who had brought her here. She had lived her life learning to sense danger, and this place hummed with it. It was a sleeping dragon, and she was trapped in its belly. Was this what he was protecting her from? Or was this oppressive feeling coming from him? The guard led her back toward her room after a solitary meal she barely touched. They passed down a corridor she hadn't seen before, one that seemed to lead to a deeper, older part of the fortress. At the end of it stood a single door. It was not wood, like the others. It was thick, reinforced steel, with no handle on their side, only a heavy, multi-bolt locking mechanism. It looked like the entrance to a vault. As they drew near, she heard it. A sound that made the blood in her veins run cold. It was a scratching, a frantic, desperate clawing against the other side of the steel. It was followed by a low, guttural growl that was filled with so much agony it barely sounded like an animal. It was a sound of torment, of a creature being ripped apart from the inside. Lyra stopped, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning horror. The sound was both familiar and terrifyingly alien. It held a sliver of the beast that had marked her, but magnified 1,000 times, twisted into a symphony of pain. She looked at the guard, but his expression was a blank, impenetrable wall. He gave her a slight, insistent push, urging her to keep moving, his face betraying nothing. He refused to acknowledge the monstrous suffering happening just feet away. She let him guide her away, her mind reeling. Cassian hadn't just built a cage for her. He had one for himself, too. And the thing he locked away behind that steel door was a monster far more terrifying than the alpha she had met in the woods. Chapter 8. Whispers of a Curse. An old woman with kind, sad eyes brought Lyra her dinner that evening. Unlike the stone-faced guards, she offered a small, hesitant smile. Her name was Elena, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had served in this house of secrets for a very long time. She set the tray down, her gaze lingering on the silver mark that peeked from the collar of Lyra's tunic. It pulsed with a soft, steady light, a permanent brand of her new reality. Lyra had been turning the question over and over in her mind, the sound from behind the steel door a horrifying echo she couldn't shake. She had to know. "What is he keeping in this house?" Lyra asked, her voice low. Elena's smile faltered. She wrung her hands in her apron, her eyes darting toward the door as if the Alpha himself might be listening. "Master Cassian. He does what he must. Everything he does is to keep people safe." "Safe from what?" Lyra pressed, standing up. "Safe from the thing he has locked away? From the beast that was clawing at that door?" The old woman flinched, her face paling. "You shouldn't have been taken down that hall," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He tries so hard to keep it separate." She looked at Lyra, at the defiance in her eyes, and a wave of pity seemed to break through her loyalty. "He isn't locking you in to be cruel, child. He is doing it to protect you. From himself." The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth Lyra didn't want to understand. Because she could not accept his actions, Lyra demanded more. "What do you mean?" Elena took a deep breath, her decision made. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was barely audible. "There is a curse on his line, an old, dark magic, the beast inside him. It is not like other alphas. It is tainted, corrupted." She paused, her eyes filling with a profound sorrow. The mate bond, the one that should be a source of life and strength. For him, it is a death sentence. Not for him, for his mate. The pieces began to click into place, each one more horrifying than the last. Every woman his wolf has ever marked has died. A cold dread washed over Lyra, so potent it made her dizzy. She thought of the raw power in the mark on her shoulder, the way it seemed to feed a light of its own. "The rogues," she breathed. "He said they would kill me." "They would," Elena agreed, shaking her head. "But they are not the true danger. The curse, it twists the bond. It turns it into a poison. It feeds on the mate's life force, growing stronger as she grows weaker. He can't control it. No one can." This information shattered Lyra's entire perception of her situation. Cassian wasn't just a controlling tyrant. He was a man living with a horrific, deadly affliction. He hadn't locked her away out of possessiveness. He had locked her away because his very love was a weapon aimed at her heart. Her fury, the righteous anger that had kept her warm, began to dissolve, replaced by a confusing, terrifying mix of fear and empathy. He was a monster, yes, but he was also a prisoner, chained to a destiny he never chose. That night, sleep was impossible. The new knowledge festered in her mind. Was his cruelty an act of desperation? Was his cage an act of love? The questions were a poison of their own. As she lay staring into the darkness, she heard it again. A sound from just outside her bedroom door. It wasn't the guards on their patrol. It was a soft, heavy scratching against the thick oak. A low, mournful sound followed, a growl that was less a threat and more a plea. It was him. His wolf, drawn to her by the bond it had forged, was on the other side of the door, and the only thing keeping its deadly affection from consuming her was a few inches of wood and a heavy lock. Chapter 9. Portraits in the West Wing. For 3 days, the knowledge of the curse festered inside Lyra like a sickness. She paced the confines of her room, a tiger in a silk-lined cage, the truth a far more effective prison than any lock. Her hatred for Cassian had become a tangled, confusing mess. How can you hate a man for trying to save your life, even if his methods are monstrous? How can you fear a beast that is, itself, a victim? The need to understand, to see the proof of this curse with her own eyes, became an obsession. Her opportunity came on the 4th day. She heard a commotion down the hall, a raised voice, and the heavy thud of running feet. For the first time, the guard outside her door was gone, called away by the emergency, and in his haste he had not fully engaged the lock. With her heart pounding in her ears, Lyra slowly turned the handle. The latch clicked open. Freedom, however brief, was a breath of fresh air she hadn't realized she was starving for. She didn't run for the exit. She knew that was a fool's errand. Instead, she moved like a ghost through the silent, empty halls, her destination clear in her mind. The West Wing. The one place he had forbidden her to go. The prohibition was a magnet, pulling her toward the heart of his secret. The air grew colder as she entered the forbidden corridor, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a place steeped in sorrow. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight piercing through grimy high windows. The silence here was different. It was the heavy, weighted silence of grief. She found a door slightly ajar and pushed it open. The room beyond was not a bedroom or a study. It was a place of torment. Thick silver chains, their links as wide as her wrist, were bolted directly into the stone walls and floor. The chains were a physical manifestation of the curse, meant to hold a beast of unimaginable power. The floor beneath them was darker than the surrounding stone, stained with old, faded patches that spoke of long-ago struggles and spilled blood. But it was what was on the wall that stole the breath from her lungs and made her knees weak. It was a gallery of portraits. 3 of them. The first was of a woman with fiery red hair and a defiant smile, her eyes sparkling with a life that had clearly been extinguished. The second showed a woman with gentle, dark features and a serene expression that seemed at odds with the brutal chains in the same room. The third was a woman with blonde hair and a mischievous glint in her eyes. They were all beautiful, all different, and yet, all hauntingly familiar. They had her eyes. Not the same color, but the same shape, the same depth. They shared a certain bone structure, a particular curve of the lip. They looked like they could have been her sisters, her cousins, her ancestors. Why? Why did they all look like her? As she stood there, paralyzed by the horrifying implications, a shadow fell across the doorway. Lyra didn't need to turn around. She could feel his presence, a wave of cold dread and immense power. Cassian stood there, his broad frame filling the entrance. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of cold authority. His face was stripped bare, revealing a landscape of raw, devastating pain. He saw her. He saw her looking at the portraits of the dead women who looked just like her, and then at the silver chains meant to hold their killer. The silence stretched thick with unspoken tragedy. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the growl of an alpha, but the fractured, hollow whisper of a man who had lost everything, over and over again. You shouldn't have seen this. Chapter 10. A Gallery of Ghosts. The silence in the West Wing was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was filled with the ghosts of the women on the wall and the agony of the man in the doorway. Cassian didn't move. He just stood there, his face a canvas of such profound devastation that Lyra felt a traitorous pang of empathy cut through her shock. He looked at the portraits, then at her, and the connection was so obvious, so horrible that no one needed to speak it aloud. They were her ghosts, her legacy, a line of women who looked like her, loved a man like him, and died for it. She finally found her voice, a harsh scraping sound in the dead air. Who were they? He flinched, the question hitting him like a physical blow. He finally stepped into the room, his presence shrinking the space, filling it with a grief so immense it felt like it had its own gravity. My great-grandmother, Lyra, he said, his voice a low rumble of pain as he gestured to the woman with fiery red hair. My grandmother, Serafina. The serene, dark-haired woman. And my mother, Isolde, the blonde with the mischievous smile. His voice cracked on the last name, breaking apart on the word mother. They all carried the same ancient bloodline, the same one you carry, a line of powerful healers, of women with an affinity for the wild magic of our kind. He looked at her, his golden eyes pleading for her to understand. And they were all mated to the alpha of this pack, to my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father. Lyra's mind was spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of a history she never knew she had. My mother, she told me to fear alphas. She never said why. Because she knew, Cassian whispered, his voice raw. She knew what happens when your bloodline and mine are joined by the mate bond. It awakens the curse. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of complete exhaustion. It's not just my wolf, Lyra. It's a separate entity, a passenger, a thing of pure destructive hunger that has been bound to my family for generations. It lies dormant until the bond clicks into place. And then, it feeds. It twists the connection, turning the love and life force of the mate into its own power, and it doesn't stop until she is gone. He couldn't say the word dead. He didn't have to. The portraits on the wall screamed it. Rage, hot and clean, surged through her, burning away the cold shock. So you lock me away? You burn my life down and throw me in a cage and call it protection? The injustice of it was a bitter pill. He was treating her like another inevitable tragedy, another portrait to be hung on his wall of sorrow. Yes! He roared, the sound exploding in the confined space, echoing off the stone and rattling the very chains on the floor. The beast in him surfaced for a moment, his eyes flashing a dangerous gold. I lock you away because it's the only thing I can do. I keep you from my touch because my touch is poison. I keep you from my heart because my heart is a death sentence. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a desperate, broken whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shout. The bond is already active. The curse is already stirring. I can feel it, and the only thing holding it back, the only reason you are still breathing, is distance. My control. He looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like it was stripping her soul bare. "Don't you understand? If you die, it's not just you I lose." He reached out, his hand trembling, stopping just an inch from her face. "I lose myself forever. The man is consumed, and only the monster remains." Chapter 11. An Anchor in the Storm. The confession left a gaping wound in the air between them. Cassian, raw and exposed, looked like a man on the verge of collapsing. Lyra felt like she was drowning in the impossible truth of it all. He turned to lead her from the room of sorrows, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his legacy, his movements stiff. He was putting the mask back on, rebuilding the walls of the cold, unfeeling Alpha. But she had seen the man underneath. She had seen the prisoner rattling the bars of his own cursed cage. It was as he was closing the door to the west wing behind them, sealing the ghosts away, that the world erupted in violence. The sound was like a thunderclap inside the house, a massive pane of glass in the great hall shattering, spraying crystalline shards across the marble floor. Shouts erupted from the guards, followed by the guttural, savage snarls of attacking wolves. Rogues. They had breached the fortress. The speed of the attack was shocking, a testament to their desperation. Cassian moved instantly, all his personal agony vanishing, replaced by pure lethal instinct. He shoved Lyra behind his massive frame, his body becoming a shield. "Stay behind me," he commanded, his voice the pure, undiluted authority of an alpha at war. 3 large, mangy wolves scrambled through the broken window, their lips curled back to reveal yellowed teeth, their eyes glowing with a crazed, hungry light. They were gaunt, scarred, and moved with a reckless abandon that made them incredibly dangerous. They were not here to conquer. They were here to die, and to take as much as they could with them. 2 of Cassian's guards met them, shifting into their own powerful wolf forms in a blur of motion. The hall became a whirlwind of fur, claws, and blood. But more rogues were coming. Then, the beast within Cassian answered the call of battle. He roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mansion. And it was not a man's rage. It was the curse. His body contorted, bones snapping and reforming with sickening speed. He grew larger, his form more brutal and twisted than a normal shifter's. His fur was the color of midnight, his eyes burning gold embers of pure, uncontrolled fury. He was magnificent and terrifying. He tore into the rogues not just with the strength of an alpha, but with the berserker rage of the entity that lived inside him. He was a force of nature, a living hurricane of destruction. He was also completely out of control. After dispatching one rogue with a sickening snap of its neck, he turned, his mad gaze sweeping the room. It wasn't the gaze of an ally. It was the indiscriminate rage of a monster that no longer recognized friend from foe. One of his own guards got too close, and the cursed wolf lunged, sinking its teeth into the guard's shoulder, throwing him across the room like a toy. It was going to kill them all. The curse didn't care who it hurt. Lyra watched in horror, her heart hammering against her ribs. Everyone was frozen, terrified of the ally who had become the greatest threat. But Lyra wasn't just anyone. She was his mate. Acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she moved. While everyone else backed away, she stepped forward. "Cassian!" She screamed his name. The beast paused, its head tilting at the sound. It was still a monster, but for a split second, it hesitated. That was all she needed. She ran toward him, her hand outstretched. It was a suicidal act, but something deep inside her, something connected to the glowing mark on her shoulder, told her it was the only way. She slammed her palm flat against the monster's heaving, blood-slicked chest. A jolt, powerful and electric, shot through both of them. The beast shuddered violently, a whine of confusion and pain escaping its throat. The burning gold in its eyes flickered, and then, under her hand, the raging storm calmed. The wolf collapsed, its massive form shrinking, melting, until the man, Cassian, lay unconscious and bleeding on the floor at her feet. Lyra stood over him, her body trembling with adrenaline and a shocking new realization. She wasn't just his weakness. She might be his cure. And as she looked down at his vulnerable human face, a terrifying and undeniable thought rose from the depths of her heart. She wanted him. Chapter 12. A Shift in Power. The aftermath of the attack was a tableau of quiet devastation. The remaining rogue was dead, one of Cassian's guards was badly wounded, and the great hall was a wreck of shattered glass and splattered blood. Elena and other staff members rushed in, their faces pale with shock, moving with a practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time their home had become a battlefield. They tended to the injured guard and began to clean up the chaos, their movements silent and respectful around the alpha who still lay unconscious on the floor. Lyra hadn't moved. She remained standing over him, her hands still tingling from the shock of contact, her mind replaying the moment the raging storm inside him had bowed to her touch. Cassian stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open, not the burning gold of the beast, but the human, amber-flecked eyes of the man. They were filled with confusion at first, then a dawning, sickening horror as he took in the scene around him. The blood, the wounded guard, and her, standing over him. He knew he had lost control. He pushed himself up, his body aching, his gaze locking on her with an intensity that was more fear than anger. He saw the way she was looking at him, not with terror, but with a strange, new light in her eyes, and it terrified him. "Get away from me," he rasped, his voice rough. He scrambled back, putting distance between them as if she were the one who was dangerous. What it did, it could have killed you. It could have killed everyone. But it didn't, Lyra said, her own voice surprisingly steady. The trembling in her body had stopped, replaced by a strange, humming strength. The power dynamic between them had fractured, and the pieces were settling in a new, unknown pattern. "I stopped it. It was a fluke," he snapped, shaking his head, denying the evidence of his own senses. "A one-time thing. You don't know what you're dealing with." He was afraid. She could see it clearly now. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid for her. He was terrified of the hope that her touch represented, because hope was something he had learned to live without. Hope was a vulnerability the curse could exploit. "The rules haven't changed. You will stay in your room. You will stay away from me. This changes nothing." Lyra took a step toward him, and for the first time, he was the one who flinched. She was no longer just his prisoner. She was the one person who had ever been able to leash the monster inside him. That gave her a power he could not lock away. "You're wrong," she said, her voice soft but laced with unbending steel. "It changes everything." She looked him in the eye, unafraid. "You see a weakness you need to protect. I see an answer we need to understand. You see a victim you have to cage. I see the only person on earth who can touch the darkest part of you and make it calm down." Her trust in him was gone, but it was being replaced by a dangerous, defiant faith in them. She would not cower in his prison anymore, waiting to die. She was going to fight. He stared at her, caught between his ingrained fear and the undeniable truth of her words. He saw not the frightened girl from the woods, but a woman who was finding her own power, a power that was inextricably linked to his curse. He saw a future he had never dared to imagine, one that was both a salvation and a potential ruin. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his retreat a confirmation of her victory. He couldn't face her. He couldn't face the hope she was forcing him to feel. Lyra watched him go, her heart a wild mix of fear and exhilaration. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a player in this deadly game. As she stood alone in the wrecked hall, a low, possessive growl echoed in her mind, a sound that came not from the hallway but from the bond itself. It was the voice of his wolf, deep and resonant, making a promise the man was too afraid to keep. Mine. Chapter 13. A choice made in dust and moonlight. The mansion was a different kind of prison now. The locked door to her room was no longer a barrier, but a starting line. Lyra spent her days exploring the parts of the fortress she could access, a ghost haunting the edges of Cassian's lonely kingdom. She watched him from a distance, saw him training his men with a brutal efficiency, saw him poring over old maps in his study, a king consumed by a silent war. He was avoiding her, keeping to his vow of distance. But the bond between them was a living thread, a constant, humming pressure in her soul. It told her when he was near, when he was in pain, when the beast inside him was stirring. And it told her, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that he felt her, too. Her search for answers became a quiet obsession. Elena, seeing the shift in Lyra from a captive to a strategist, softened. She began leaving doors unlocked, turning a blind eye to Lyra's wanderings. It was during one of these clandestine explorations that Lyra found it. A small, hidden library behind a tapestry in a forgotten hall. It was his mother's, Isolde's. The room was a sanctuary of feminine knowledge in the brutally masculine fortress. It smelled of dried flowers and old paper. Here, Lyra found what she was looking for. Tucked away in a leather-bound volume of folklore was a slim, personal journal. Isolde's handwriting was a delicate, looping script, a stark contrast to the horrors it described. She wrote of the curse, of her love for Cassian's father, and of her own slow, inexorable decline. He locks himself away from me, one entry read, believing his cage will save me. But the curse does not feed on proximity. It feeds on the passive bond. A bond unchallenged is a feast for the beast. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. All of Cassian's efforts, his self-imposed isolation, his entire philosophy of protection through control, it was wrong. It was a slow, agonizing surrender. But then, Lyra found a passage that made her heart stop. "The healers of my line are not merely anchors," Isolde wrote. "We are keys. The curse is a lock of dark magic. To break it, a key must be turned. It requires a ritual of binding, not of breaking. A willing heart, a shared strength, under the light of the blood moon. The cost is absolute. One cannot turn a key without entering the lock. It was a riddle, a half-formed hope, but it was something. It was a weapon. The curse didn't have to be a death sentence. It could be a battle they could fight together." That night, she did not wait for him to come to her. She went to him. She found him in the observatory at the top of the fortress, a circular room with a ceiling of glass that opened to the star-dusted sky. He stood in a beam of moonlight, his back to her, a lonely silhouette against the cosmos. "You're wrong," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet room. He stiffened but didn't turn around. "Go back to your room, Lyra." "No." She walked toward him, her footsteps echoing softly. "You think locking yourself away, locking me away, is keeping me safe. It's not. It's just letting the curse win slowly." She held up the journal. "Your mother knew. She knew there was another way. A ritual. A way to fight." He finally turned, his face a mask of anguish. "A ritual that killed her. She tried it with my father. It drained her, made her weaker, and the curse took her in a single night. It is a fairy tale, a false hope that leads to a faster death." "She was already dying, Cassian," Lyra insisted, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "She was weak from months of the curse feeding on her. She said it herself. A passive bond is a feast for the beast. We are not being passive anymore." She closed the distance between them, stopping just before him, forcing him to look at her, to see the fight in her eyes. "I am not another one of your ghosts. I am not another portrait for your wall of failures, and I am not running anymore." She looked up at him, this beautiful, broken man, this terrifying, tormented beast, and made the choice that would seal both their fates. "I'm staying, and I'm fighting with you." Chapter 14. A Surrender to the Storm. Her declaration hung in the starlit observatory, a challenge and a vow. Cassian stared down at her, his golden eyes a turbulent storm of warring emotions. He saw the unwavering resolve on her face, the fierce light in her gaze, and for the first time someone was looking at the monster inside him without fear, but with a battle plan. Every instinct, every lesson learned from a lifetime of tragedy, screamed at him to push her away, to lock her in the deepest dungeon and throw away the key. It was the only way he knew how to love, by caging it. But the bond, that invisible, undeniable tether between their souls, hummed with a different truth. It sang with her strength. It pulsed with the hope he had tried so desperately to kill. "You don't know what you're asking," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed grief. "The cost," Isolde said, it was absolute. "You would be binding yourself to the very thing that wants to consume you." "I am already bound to it," Lyra countered softly, her gaze never wavering. "We both are. The only choice left is how we face it. Do we wait in separate cells for the executioner, or do we face him together on the battlefield?" She took a final, trembling step, closing the last inch of space between them. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of pine and cold night air that clung to him. Her hand, acting of its own accord, rose and rested on his chest, right over his heart. She felt the frantic, powerful rhythm beneath her palm. "Stop fighting me," she pleaded, "and let me fight for you." Her touch was his undoing. It was not like the desperate, instinctual contact in the great hall. This was a choice. A deliberate, gentle pressure that bypassed all his defenses and went straight to the core of him. A shudder racked his massive frame. A sound, half growl, half groan, was torn from his throat. It was the sound of a man who had been holding back a tidal wave for his entire life, and the dam had just cracked. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then back to her eyes, and in that moment, he surrendered. Not to the curse, but to her. To the terrifying, beautiful possibility she represented. His hands came up, not to push her away, but to gently cup her face. His calloused thumbs traced the line of her jaw, his touch a reverence that made her breath catch. "Lyra," he breathed her name, and it was not a statement, but a prayer. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of desperation and longing, of fear and a ferocious, all-consuming need. It was the taste of a dying man finding his first drop of water. It was lightning and thunder, a storm breaking after a century of drought. Lyra's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, answering his raw hunger with her own. This was not about the curse, or the ritual, or the fight to come. This was about this single stolen moment, about two broken souls finding a temporary solace in the eye of a hurricane. He swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her from the observatory, his lips never leaving hers. He didn't take her back to her beautiful cage. He took her to his own chambers, a stark, barren room that spoke of a man who did not believe he deserved comfort. There in his bed they came together not as captor and captive, not as alpha and healer, but as a man and a woman who were drowning and had found their only raft in each other. It was a fierce, passionate claiming, a desperate, vulnerable sharing. For one night, there was no curse, no prophecy, no ghosts on the wall. There was only them. Only the pulse of the bond, now singing a triumphant, harmonious song. As their bodies and souls finally truly connected, a tremor ran through the very foundations of the mansion. The silver mark on her shoulder flashed, not with a gentle glow, but with a sudden, violent, ravenous light. The curse, dormant for so long, had just been awakened, and it was starving. Chapter 15. The Price of a Stolen Night. Lyra woke slowly, wrapped in the unfamiliar warmth and weight of Cassian's arm slung protectively over her waist. For a fleeting, blissful moment, there was only the scent of him, the steady beat of his heart against her back, and the memory of the night's fierce tenderness. It was the first time she had felt truly safe in years, a dangerous and seductive illusion. She had willingly stepped into the heart of the storm, and for a few hours, it had felt like a sanctuary. But the morning light creeping through the window brought with it a cold, sobering reality. A wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing her down into the mattress. It wasn't the pleasant weariness that follows a sleepless, passionate night. This was a deep, cellular fatigue, a draining of her very essence. Her limbs felt heavy, her thoughts sluggish. A faint, persistent chill had settled deep in her bones, a cold that the warmth of Cassian's body could not touch. With a growing sense of dread, she carefully slipped from his grasp and padded to the large, ornate mirror across the room. The reflection that stared back terrified her. She was pale, her skin holding a translucent, almost ghostly quality. There were dark, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. She looked diminished, as if some of her vital color had been leached away in the night. Her gaze dropped to her shoulder. The mark was no longer a soft, ethereal silver. It had changed. The edges were now a dark, angry charcoal gray, and the intricate lines of the bite were stark and black against her pale skin. It pulsed with a sluggish, hungry light, no longer a beacon but a siphon. The curse was feeding, and it was feeding on her. A gasp escaped her lips, and the sound woke Cassian. He was on his feet in an instant, his alpha instincts on high alert. He saw her standing before the mirror, saw the horror on her face, and his gaze followed hers to the mark. The blood drained from his face. All the warmth from the night, all the fragile hope she had given him vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar despair that was 1,000 times worse than before. Because now he knew what he stood to lose. He had let himself feel, let himself hope, and this was the immediate, brutal consequence. He rushed to her side, his fingers gently tracing the dark edges of the brand. His touch was no longer a lover's caress. It was a physician's diagnostic, filled with a frantic, desperate fear. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice tight with dread. "Tired," she whispered, the single word a massive understatement. "Cold." He closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw clenching. He had done this, his one moment of surrender, his one night of selfishly taking the comfort she offered, had accelerated her demise. The bond, now fully and deeply consummated, had opened the floodgates. The beast was no longer sipping at her life force. It was drinking it down in great greedy gulps. The very act that had felt like their salvation had become their damnation. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, his strong body trembling with a terrible silent sob. He was holding her, but it felt like he was already holding a memory. The price for their stolen night was her life, and the bill had just come due. His worst fear was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty unfolding before his very eyes. Looking over her head at their haunted reflections in the mirror, he whispered the words that confirmed their shared nightmare, his voice nothing more than a broken, horrified breath. "The curse is feeding on us." Chapter 16, The Coldest Cage. The warmth of the previous night was a ghost, a phantom memory that mocked Lyra with its absence. The cold that had settled in her bones was now a relentless, creeping ice, a physical manifestation of the curse's feast. Cassian held her, but it wasn't an embrace of a lover. It was the desperate, crushing grip of a man trying to hold on to smoke. He was looking at the darkened mark on her shoulder, his face a mask of such utter self-loathing that it was more terrifying than any rage. The hope she had foolishly ignited in him had turned to ash. And now a bitter, cold certainty was taking its place. He was rebuilding his walls, stone by heavy stone, right before her eyes. "I was a fool," he whispered, the words scraping from his throat. He released her and stepped back. The distance he created a gaping chasm between them. The lover was gone. In his place stood the alpha, his eyes hard and empty, his posture radiating a chilling, absolute authority. A complete and utter fool to think we could fight this, to think your strength could be anything but another meal for it. Lyra pushed herself upright, the effort making her head swim. "No," she pleaded, her voice thin, lacking the strength it had held in the observatory. Your mother's journal. It said passivity was the danger. We made a choice, we can't. I made a mistake, he cut her off, his voice like the crack of a whip. I let my own weakness, my own selfish need for you, put you in this position. It has to be undone. He turned away from her, his broad back a wall of finality. He strode to the door of his chambers and threw it open, his voice booming into the hallway. Guards! Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her fatigue. Cassian, don't do this. Don't go back to what you were. We have to trust each other. That's the only way. She tried to get out of the bed to go to him, but her legs felt like lead. The curse was anchoring her down. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. Trust is the luxury that got us here, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It is a poison I can no longer afford. I will not stand by and watch you fade away day by day. I will not watch you become another portrait on the wall. Two of his guards appeared at the door, their faces grim. They saw Lyra, the state she was in, and understood immediately. This was not a punishment. It was a quarantine. Please, she begged, tears welling in her eyes, tears of frustration and a profound sense of betrayal. You're choosing the cage over me. He finally turned, and his eyes were the bleakest they had ever been. The cage is the only thing that can keep you alive longer than a week, he stated, as if reciting a law of physics. I am choosing to give you more time, even if you spend it hating me. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. They entered the room and moved toward her. She didn't have the strength to fight them. One of them gently lifted her into his arms, wrapping her in the silk sheet from the bed. She felt like a fragile, broken doll being carried from the scene of an accident. They carried her past Cassian, who stood like a statue, his face carved from stone. He wouldn't meet her eyes. They didn't take her back to her luxurious room. They took her down. Down past the marble floors and the empty halls, down past the steel door to the west wing, down a winding set of stone stairs into the fortress's cold, damp belly. The air grew colder, smelling of earth and old secrets. They stopped before a heavy iron-banded door set into the rough-hewn stone wall. This wasn't a room. It was a cell. They placed her gently on a simple cot inside. As they retreated, Cassian appeared in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the light from the hall. For a second, she thought she saw the man again, the one who had held her under the stars. But it was just a trick of the light. He pulled the heavy door shut. The sound of the iron bolt sliding into place was the sound of her last hope dying. She screamed his name, a raw, ragged sound of heartbreak. But the only reply was the echoing silence of the stone. Chapter 17. A Secret Buried in Stone. Time in the dungeon was a thick, sluggish thing, measured only by the slow crawl of a single beam of moonlight across the damp stone floor. The cold was relentless. It wasn't just the chill of the underground air. It was the curse, a parasite growing fat and happy in the darkness, leeching the warmth from her very marrow. Lyra lay on the cot, wrapped in a single, thin blanket, too weak to even shiver. The despair was a physical weight, heavier than the fortress above her. Cassian had not just locked her body away. He had locked away their chance, their one, fragile hope, and left it to die in the dark with her. She had thought his previous cage was born of fear, but this felt like it was born of a hopelessness so absolute it bordered on cruelty. Late on what she thought was the second day, she heard the scrape of the bolt. The heavy door groaned open, and a sliver of light cut through the gloom. It wasn't Cassian. It was Elena, the old servant, her face a road map of worry and pity. She carried a cup of water and another blanket, her movements quiet and furtive. "He is wrong," Lyra whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "He thinks he's saving me, but he's just waiting for me to die." Elena set the water beside the cot, her hand trembling. "He is a man haunted by more than just his mother's ghost, child." Her eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow. "He has seen this play out before, and it never ends well. I know about his mother. I know about all of them, Lyra insisted, a flicker of her old fire returning. But they didn't know what we know. They didn't have the journal. Elena shook her head slowly, her gaze distant. There was another, she said, her voice barely a whisper. One whose portrait does not hang on the wall. One he never speaks of because the memory is too raw. The words dropped into the silence of the cell, each one a stone sinking into a deep, dark well. It was his aunt, his father's younger sister named Lyra after the first. She was born with the healer's gift, but not destined for the alpha. She was free. She fell in love. A true, deep love, with a beta from a neighboring pack. It was not a fated alpha bond, so they thought they were safe. A knot of dread tightened in Lyra's stomach. She knew, with a sickening certainty, where this story was going. The curse doesn't care about fate or destiny, Elena continued, her voice thick with the memory of it. It cares only about the bloodline and the power of a true connection. Their love. It was so strong, so pure. It woke the beast that slept in her blood. It twisted their bond just the same. His father, the alpha at the time, did what Cassian is doing now. He locked her away for her own safety. Cassian was just a boy, barely a man. He watched her waste away. He saw what this protection does. Elena paused, her eyes closing as if to block out the image. But the boy she loved wouldn't stay away. He tried to rescue her. In the chaos, the curse in her was provoked. It broke free. What happened? Lyra breathed, already knowing the answer. It killed him, brutally, and when it was done, the curse consumed her too. Cassian. He was the one who found them. Elena's voice finally broke. He doesn't believe the curse can be beaten because he saw with his own eyes that it will always find a way. It will cheat. It will find any love, any bond, and turn it into a weapon. The story slammed into Lyra, shattering the last fragile remnants of her hope into dust. This wasn't about a generational pattern for Cassian. It was a specific, formative trauma. He had seen the absolute worst-case scenario. He had seen love itself become the trigger for the slaughter. Her defiance, her belief that their bond was the key, suddenly seemed like a naive, childish fantasy. The curse wasn't a lock to be opened. It was a hungry god that demanded a sacrifice. As Elena slipped away, leaving Lyra alone with this new, devastating truth, a sound from above made the floor vibrate. It was a roar, not of one wolf, but of many, followed by the sounds of a brutal, desperate battle. The rogues had come back. They could smell her weakness. They could smell the key to their own salvation, dying in a cell, and they were tearing the fortress apart to get to her. Chapter 18. The Mercy of a Monster. The sounds of war overhead were a distant, chaotic symphony. Lyra could hear the screams, the snarls of shifting wolves, the sickening crunch of bone. The battle was not confined to the upper levels anymore. It was descending, a wave of violence spilling down the stone stairwells of the fortress. The rogues were fighting with the desperation of fanatics, and she knew why. They weren't here for territory. They were here for her. The curse that was killing her was a source of immense dark power, and her blood, the blood of a healer marked by it, was the key to unlocking it for themselves. She was the prize, a living sacrifice, and the walls of her prison were failing. She lay on the cot, a profound and hollow acceptance settling over her. Her body was a traitor, too weak to even crawl into a corner. Her heart, which had raged with such fire and defiance, was now a slow, tired drum, beating out the final rhythm of her life. She had fought, she had hoped, she had loved. And it had all led to this: a cold stone cell, waiting for one monster to save her from others. It was a bitter, tragic irony. The heavy iron door of her cell, the symbol of her betrayal, suddenly groaned, the metal screeching as something of impossible strength slammed into it from the other side. Once, twice. On the third impact, the lock shattered, and the door flew inward, crashing against the stone wall. Framed in the doorway was not a rogue. It was a nightmare. Cassian. But it was not him, not the man. It was the lichen, the curse given flesh and form. He was immense, larger than any wolf had a right to be. His midnight fur matted with blood, some his, some not. His eyes were not just gold, they were pits of burning, hellish light, devoid of all reason, all humanity. He was the personification of the curse, a walking apocalypse, and he had just torn through his own men and the enemy alike to get to her. He took a step into the cell, his massive claws scraping grooves into the stone floor. He looked at her, lying there, so fragile and pale, a dying bird in a stone nest. A low growl rumbled in his chest, but it was not a sound of aggression toward her. It was a sound of assessment. In the swirling madness of the beast's mind, a single twisted thought took root, a perversion of the alpha's instinct to protect his mate. He saw her, fading and weak. He could smell the rogues, could sense their dark intentions for her, to capture her, bleed her, use her in some agonizing ritual that would be a fate 1,000 times worse than a clean death. The curse, in its ultimate act of possessive control, offered its own solution, its own dark mercy. It would save her from that suffering. It would save her from them, by ending her now. He advanced on her, each step a deliberate final judgment. Lyra looked up at the monster that was once the man she loved. There was no recognition in those burning eyes, no memory of the stars or the stolen night. There was only the beast, acting on its own terrible protective logic. She had no energy left to scream, no will left to run. This was it, the end of her line. Another portrait for the gallery of ghosts. It was her destiny, after all. She closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. She would not give the beast the satisfaction of her fear. As the shadow of his massive form fell over her, as she felt the heat of his breath on her skin and heard the unsheathing of his claws, she let out a final quiet breath. It was not a scream or a plea. It was a whisper, a last heartbreaking echo of the woman she had been, a farewell to the man he once was. Cassian. The name, so soft, so full of sorrow and acceptance, struck the raging storm of the lichen's mind. It was a sound that did not belong in the chaos of battle. It was a memory, a name, his name. Mid-lunge, his claws inches from her throat, the beast froze. The burning gold in its eyes flickered, just for an instant, with a spark of confused, agonizing conflict. The monster was still in control, but for the first time, the man was listening. Chapter 19. The wolf is not the enemy. Her name. His name. The whisper of it hung in the air of the cold, damp cell, a fragile thread in a storm of monstrous rage. The lichen stood frozen over her, its massive claws extended, its body a taut sculpture of imminent violence. But its burning, golden eyes were no longer fixed on her throat. They were clouded, a flicker of profound confusion warring with the pure, destructive instinct of the curse. The man inside, the one she had called, was fighting. He was a prisoner inside his own skin, and her whisper had just passed him the key. In that single, heartbeat-long pause, everything shifted. Lyra saw not an executioner, but a victim. The beast wasn't the monster. The curse was. A memory, sharp and sudden as a lightning strike, flashed behind her eyes. It was her mother, years ago, her face pale in the moonlight on the night they fled their first home. She was clutching Lyra's small hand, her voice urgent and low. "Listen to me, little bird," she had said, her eyes filled with a desperate, ancient wisdom. "They will tell you to fear the wolf, but the wolf is not your enemy. Fear is. Fear is the cage they build for you, and the poison they ask you to drink." The words, which had been a confusing riddle for a child, now bloomed in her mind with the force of a revelation. She had been afraid. She had feared Cassian's power, feared the bond, feared the curse, and her fear had fed it, making it stronger. Cassian's fear had led him to build cages. Their shared terror was the curse's favorite meal. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her body's profound weakness, Lyra moved. She didn't scramble away in terror. She rolled off the cot, onto the floor, and into the beast's space, pressing herself against its massive, furred leg. It was a gesture of absolute surrender, an act so contrary to every survival instinct that the lichen stumbled back, a bewildered whine tearing from its throat. The chaos of the battle was still raging in the halls above, but in this small cell, a different kind of war was being waged. She wasn't fighting the wolf anymore. She was fighting with Cassian against their common enemy. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice still weak, but now imbued with a strange, new calm. "I'm not scared of you." The beast let out a roar of conflict, shaking the very stones, and then it turned and bolted from the cell, a whirlwind of confused fury. It wasn't retreating from her in aggression, but in a panicked flight from the one thing it couldn't comprehend: acceptance. Lyra used the moment, her body screaming in protest, to pull herself up. She was free. The battle outside was her cover. She stumbled from the dungeon, her legs shaking, her vision swimming. The lower levels of the fortress were a war zone. Rogues and guards, wolf and man, were locked in brutal combat. No one paid her any mind. She was just a ghost slipping through the carnage. Her goal wasn't the main gate. It was the library. Isolde's library. She had to read the ritual again, not as a desperate hope, but as a battle plan. She was no longer a victim waiting for a curse to claim her. She was a healer with a poison to cure, and the first step was to stop being afraid of her own medicine. Chapter 20. To tame a god. She found him in the Great Hall, the same place where she had first seen the beast's berserker rage. The battle was mostly over, the bodies of rogues and a few of his own men littering the shattered marble floor. He stood in the center of the destruction, the lichen still in control, but the mindless fury was gone. Now it was a contained storm, a thing of terrible, potent sorrow. It paced a tight circle around the body of a fallen guard, a low, mournful keen vibrating in its massive chest. It was a god of destruction mourning its own creation. Lyra stepped into the hall, her bare feet silent on the cold, glass-strewn floor. Every instinct a human possesses screamed at her to hide, but her mother's words echoed louder. "The wolf is not your enemy." "Cassian," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the low growl of his grief. The beast's head snapped up, its burning eyes locked onto her. It saw her not as a threat, but as the source of its profound confusion. It took a step toward her, a deep, warning rumble starting in its chest. This was the moment, the turning point. She could run, and it would chase. Or she could stand, and she could fight, not with strength, but with trust. She held her ground, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was terrified, but she forced her fear down, packing it away into a small, tight ball in the pit of her stomach. She could not let it feed the monster. "I know you're in there," she said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "I'm not leaving you." The lichen snarled, a flash of its vicious, elongated teeth meant to drive her back. It was a bluff, a test. She saw it for what it was, the curse's last, desperate attempt to use fear as its weapon. Lyra took another step. This curse, it feeds on your guilt, on your pain. It feeds on my fear. But I'm done being afraid. She held out her hand, palm up, an offering, an invitation. "You are not your father. I am not your mother. We can write our own story." She called upon the bond, not with panic, but with a deep, focused calm. She pushed all the love she felt for the man, all the compassion she felt for the beast, all her fierce, desperate will to live, down that invisible thread connecting their souls. She didn't try to pull him back. She was creating an anchor, a calm port in the middle of his raging internal sea. The lichen let out a roar of agony as her calm acceptance washed over its rage. It was like pouring cool water on a fire. The curse fought back, not wanting to lose its hold. The beast lunged. It was not a feint this time. It was a full, explosive movement, a final, convulsive act of a dying power. It moved so fast, she didn't even have time to flinch. Its massive form, a black blur of fur and fury, aimed directly at her. She stood her ground, her hand still outstretched, her eyes locked on his. She was going to meet the storm head-on, even if it tore her apart. Chapter 21. The Blood and the Moon. The lichen's charge stopped with its nose a mere inch from her outstretched hand. Its hot, ragged breath washed over her skin. A final, shuddering snarl ripped through its body, a sound of profound defeat, and then the fire in its eyes went out. The immense creature collapsed, not in a heap, but in a slow, controlled melt, the bones shifting and reforming, the fur receding, until Cassian lay naked and unconscious on the floor, curled at her feet like a child. The battle was over. The man had won. Lyra sank to her knees beside him, her own strength giving out, her body trembling with the aftermath of her terror and triumph. He was alive. He was himself. They had survived. Elena and the remaining guards found them like that, a tableau of quiet victory in the midst of ruin. They worked silently, with a practiced reverence, clearing the dead and tending to the wounded. No one questioned her. No one tried to separate them. Lyra had faced the beast and calmed it. She was no longer a prisoner. She was their Luna, whether she knew it or not. She stayed by Cassian's side as they carried him to his chambers. She cleaned the blood from his skin, her touch no longer hesitant but proprietary, loving. The curse had taken a heavy toll on him as well. He was pale, his breathing shallow. They were both weakened, both running on borrowed time. When he finally woke hours later, the sun was setting, painting the room in hues of orange and blood. His human eyes, clear and sane, found hers immediately. There were no words. There was no need. Everything was laid bare between them. The horror, the hope, the shared terrible knowledge of what they still had to do. Isolde's journal, he rasped, his voice raw. Lyra nodded, holding up the small, leather-bound book. I have it. She had read the passage about the ritual a dozen times, the words now burned into her memory. A willing heart, a shared strength, under the light of the blood moon. She looked out the window. The moon was already rising, a pale sliver in the twilight sky. It would not be a blood moon for months. They didn't have that long. The curse was still inside him, and it was still tethered to her. It was quiet now, sated and weakened from the battle, but it would recover. It would get hungry again. We can't wait, Cassian said, reading her thoughts. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his body aching with a profound weariness that mirrored her own. We have to do it tonight. We have to make our own moon. He looked at her, his gaze steady, asking the most important question of her life without speaking a word. The ritual required not just a specific time, but specific ingredients. A binding of two souls, a merging of two powers. It was a desperate, arcane magic that promised either a cure or a shared grave. There was no middle ground. If it failed, they wouldn't just die. Their very souls would be consumed. Lyra met his gaze without flinching. She had made her choice in the dungeon. She had confirmed it in the Great Hall. This was just the final step. I know, she said, her voice calm and resolute. She was no longer a wounded survivor or a defiant prisoner. She was a woman ready to burn for the man she loved. She picked up a small silver ceremonial knife from a dusty case on his wall, its edge gleaming in the fading light. She walked back to him and held it out. Together. He took it, his hand closing over hers. The final plan was set. Everything in their lives, every ghost, every scar, every stolen kiss, had led them to this single, terrifying moment. Their blood would touch the moonlight, and their fates would be sealed one way or another. Chapter 22. I am not afraid. The observatory was a circle of silent, cold glass, a stage set for the end of the world. Below them, the fortress was a wounded animal, groaning with the aftermath of battle. But up here, under the impartial gaze of a million distant stars, there was only the two of them and the impossible choice they had made. The air was thin and electric with tension. Lyra's heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm, a war drum counting down to the final charge. She held her hand steady, palm up, the silver knife resting on it. Cassian stood before her, his body a roadmap of exhaustion and grim resolve. He was placing his entire existence and the legacy of all his ghosts into her hands. This was the ultimate act of trust, the final surrender of the control he had clung to for a lifetime. The journal said a willing heart, she whispered, her voice a fragile thing in the vast silence. That's all it asks for. He nodded, his golden eyes fixed on hers. He took the knife from her palm, his fingers brushing against hers. There was no spark, no jolt of the bond, only the simple warmth of human contact. With a reverence that shattered her heart, he gently took her hand and turned it over, exposing the delicate skin of her wrist. And a shared strength, he added, his voice a low rumble. He made the first cut. It was a shallow line, a whisper of pain that was nothing compared to the agony she had already endured. A line of dark, precious blood welled up, a ruby against the pale canvas of her skin. He did not let her go. Instead, he turned the knife, its silver edge gleaming in the moonlight, and drew it across his own wrist with a clean, unhesitating motion. His blood was just as red, just as mortal. He pressed his bleeding wrist against hers. The moment their blood mingled, the world went silent. The air crackled. The bond between them, the humming thread that had connected their souls, ignited. It was no longer a gentle melody. It was a roaring, blinding inferno of pure power. Lyra cried out, a sound that was half pain, half ecstasy, as a wave of raw, untamed magic surged from him into her. It was the curse, recognizing the bridge he had just built, and it was pouring across it, a ravenous army invading a new land. She felt its cold, dark hunger flooding her veins, a violation that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. And she felt Cassian's own agony as the beast inside him, goaded by the ritual, began to wake. He screamed, a sound of such torment that the glass ceiling of the observatory vibrated in sympathy. It was the scream of a man being ripped apart, of a soul being unmade. His body convulsed, bones snapping and twisting in a horrific, accelerated transformation. This was not the controlled shift of a werewolf. This was the curse breaking its chains completely. He was not just becoming a wolf. He was becoming a god of destruction. The lichen burst forth, larger, darker, and more powerful than ever before. Its fur was the void between stars, its eyes burning suns of pure, unadulterated malice. It threw its head back and roared, a sound of absolute triumph that shattered the glass dome above them, raining down a cascade of glittering shards. It was free. The ritual had failed. It had not bound the beast. It had unleashed it. The lichen turned its hellish gaze upon her. This time there was no confusion, no flicker of the man inside. There was only hunger. It saw her not as its mate, but as the final piece of the puzzle, the source of the power it needed to become eternal. It stalked toward her, a low, predatory growl rumbling in its chest. This was it. The final test. Her mother's words echoed one last time. Fear is the poison. She looked at the monster, at the pinnacle of her every nightmare, and she let the fear go. She let it drain from her, leaving behind only a strange and profound calm. She took a single step forward, her bare feet crunching on the shattered glass. She raised her hand, not in defense, but in a gesture of welcome. She placed her palm flat against the beast's massive, heaving chest, right over its raging heart. The lichen froze, its snarl dying in its throat. She leaned in close, her lips brushing against its fur, and whispered the 5 words that unmade a god and saved a man. I am not afraid. A wave of pure white light exploded from her hand, from the bond, from their very souls. It was the antithesis of the curse's darkness. The lichen screamed, a sound of disbelief and agony as the light consumed it, burning away the ancient magic, cauterizing the wounds of generations. The darkness shattered like glass. The storm outside the fortress, which had been raging in time with the beast's fury, suddenly calmed. The wind died, the clouds parted, and in the dead silence of the ruined observatory, Cassian collapsed, bloodied, broken, but finally, blessedly, free. Chapter 23. An Equal's Touch. The silence that followed the explosion of light was more profound than any sound. It was the quiet of a world holding its breath, of a fever that had finally broken. Dust motes and tiny shards of glass drifted down through the new gaping hole in the observatory ceiling, catching the gentle moonlight like fallen stars. The battle was over. The curse that had haunted a bloodline for centuries was gone, its dark energy dissipated into the night sky. Lyra knelt on the floor, her own strength gone, her body a trembling vessel of exhaustion and disbelief. It was done. They were alive. Cassian lay unconscious before her, his body curled in on itself. He was just a man now. A brutally strong, powerful man, but the monstrous, oppressive aura of the curse was gone. The air around him was clean. She could feel it in the bond, which no longer pulsed with a frantic, hungry energy, but with a soft, steady, and warm rhythm, like a sleeping heart. With a groan, she crawled the final few inches to his side. Her movements were slow, every muscle in her body protesting. The ritual had taken nearly everything from her, but it had left behind something she hadn't had before: peace. She reached out, her hand shaking, and gently brushed a lock of dark, sweat-soaked hair from his forehead. Her touch was not a test, it was not a plea, it was a simple, quiet statement of fact. You are mine, and I am yours. From the shattered doorway, Elena appeared, her face streaked with tears of awe and relief. Behind her, a handful of guards stood, their expressions a mixture of shock and reverence. One of them spoke, his voice hushed. The rogues, they are fleeing. As soon as the feeling in the air changed, they broke and ran. They saw Lyra, a small, pale woman kneeling over their formidable alpha, and they understood. She hadn't just saved him. She had saved all of them. They began to move with a quiet efficiency, their loyalty to their alpha now inextricably bound to her. They helped her move Cassian back to his chambers. They offered to tend to him, but Lyra shook her head. This was her right, her duty, her choice. She dismissed them with a gentle authority that no one questioned. Alone with him in the quiet of his room, she began the slow, intimate work of a healer. She washed the blood and grime from his skin, her hands tracing the landscape of his muscles, the old scars that told the story of his life before her, and the new ones from this final, terrible battle. She was no longer a reluctant caretaker tending to a dangerous stranger in a hidden cabin. She was not a prisoner caring for her captor. She was his equal, his partner, tending to the other half of her own soul. There was no fear in her touch, only a deep, abiding love that had been forged in terror and tempered in sacrifice. He woke just as the first pale fingers of dawn were stretching across the sky. His eyes opened, and for the first time, she saw them completely clear of the beast's shadow. They were just his eyes, a beautiful, human, amber-flecked gold, and they were filled with a dawning wonder. He looked at her, then at his own hands, then back at her, as if seeing the world for the first time. He could feel the absence of the curse, the gaping hole where the monster had lived for his entire life. It was a terrifying, liberating emptiness. You're safe, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. It wasn't a question. It was a miracle. We both are, she corrected him softly, her fingers lacing through his. The mark on her shoulder, she knew without looking, was no longer a brand of death. It was just a scar now, a memory, a symbol of a victory paid for in blood and courage. He brought her hand to his lips, his kiss a gesture of such profound gratitude and love that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. They didn't speak of the battle or the terror or the ghosts of the past. There would be time for all of that later. In the quiet of the new day, they simply held on to each other, two survivors in the calm after the storm, finally, truly, free to feel the love that had cost them everything and had saved them in the end. Chapter 24, The Open Gate. A week passed in a haze of quiet healing. The fortress, once a place of echoes and shadows, began to feel different. The oppressive, monstrous energy that had saturated its very stones was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile peace. The guards no longer looked at Lyra as a prisoner, but with a deep, unwavering respect. Elena fussed over her, pressing warm broths and herbal teas into her hands, her kind eyes always shining with a quiet joy. The physical wounds were fading, but it was the wounds of the soul that were truly beginning to mend. Lyra found herself sleeping through the night without nightmares for the first time since she was a child. The stone heart she had carried for so long was gone, and in its place was something warm and soft and resilient. Cassian healed beside her. Without the constant, draining presence of the curse, his body recovered with astonishing speed. But the real transformation was in his spirit. The hard, cold mask of the Alpha was gone. He still possessed an immense, formidable power, but it was no longer a weapon he turned on himself. He smiled. He laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the sadness from the very walls. He spoke of his past, of his mother, of the ghosts, not as a litany of failures, but as a history he could finally begin to lay to rest. He touched Lyra with a constant, gentle reverence, as if he still couldn't believe she was real, that she was safe, that his touch was no longer a poison. He was no longer a beast hiding his heart. He was simply a man learning to live with it, open and unguarded, for the first time. On the 7th day, he took her hand and led her from his chambers. He didn't speak, his expression calm and resolute. He led her through the great hall, now repaired, the morning sun streaming through the new, clear glass. He led her past the silent, respectful guards, through the massive front doors, and out into the crisp, clean air. They walked down the long, winding drive, their footsteps the only sound in the quiet morning. They stopped before the gate, the immense wrought-iron barrier that had once been the symbol of her imprisonment, the final, unbreachable wall of her cage. With a quiet deliberation, Cassian placed his hands on the heavy bars and pushed. The gates swung inward, smooth and silent on their hinges, opening a wide path to the forest and the world beyond. He turned to her, his golden eyes clear and full of a love so profound it stole her breath. He did not ask her to stay. He did not beg her to choose him. He simply opened the cage. It was the ultimate act of his transformation, the final proof that he had learned the lesson she had taught him. True protection wasn't control. It was trust. He was giving her back the freedom he had stolen, without condition, without expectation. Lyra looked at the open gate, at the path leading back to the wild, free life she had once cherished. She could walk away. She could disappear back into the woods and become a ghost again, her life entirely her own. She was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer a victim. The choice was hers, and she had never been more certain of anything in her life. She looked back at Cassian, at this man who had been her captor, her patient, her monster, and her savior. She saw the fear in his eyes, the fear that she would leave, and she saw the strength it took for him to hide it, to offer her this choice freely. A slow smile spread across her face. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. She didn't walk through the gate. Instead, she turned with him, and together, side by side, they began to walk back toward the fortress. It was not a prison anymore. It was their home. He had locked her away to save her, believing his cage was her only sanctuary. But in the end, Her love had been the key, and she had saved them both.